Good afternoon, girls. So, in today's class, we will be continuing our understanding of the tragedy of Hamlet. And as we continue with that with the same thought, we will be introduced to some different approaches which we can take towards the tragedy of Hamlet, because we have already considered a few very pertinent of those approaches, very significant opinions made by people as to why Hamlet the text and Hamlet the character is the way that it is or the way that he is. We have understood to a certain extent Freudian psychoanalytic perspective towards the text, the understanding of the Oedipal strain of complex within the character of Hamlet. However, in the next class, we will be taking that psychoanalytic approach to a one notch further. We will be studying Lacan together. Not Lacan particularly, but how his theories can be projected over our reading of the text of Hamlet. We have also approached the text from the perspective of it being a Renaissance representative text, that encompasses or that embodies the various sorts of conflicts that existed during that point of time, during the Elizabethan era at large, why it existed. And we have justified to a certain extent why Hamlet is a procrastinator if we consider him to be a representative embodiment of the Renaissance crisis or the Renaissance individual crisis that was a real, very much real phenomenon at that point of time. So today, after summarizing a few of those points, we will be taking in a different approach to Hamlet, which is, however, not completely unlinked to the strain of Renaissance. However, if I might just put it like that, this is a parallel way of approaching the Renaissance text of Hamlet, because the approaches that we will be studying today is an offshoot of the Renaissance studies, or if of the studying Hamlet through the point of view of the conflict of Renaissance, the Renaissance man, that is. So, analyzing the classical and Christian strains in Hamlet's character reveals the complexity of Shakespeare's portrayal, a complexity which mirrors the richness of the Renaissance itself. Hamlet is uniquely situated to bring out this richness of the age, standing as he does at the intersection of disparate worlds, which gives him a unique position to embody or to represent the richness of Renaissance itself. Shakespeare portrays him as a cultivated and sophisticated product of modern Christian Europe, who is suddenly asked to step out of a university classroom and into a situation which is ultimately derived from the barbaric world of a Norse saga, or from the classical text or the classical aura that preceded Renaissance. Thus, what makes Hamlet a quintessential or the quintessential tragic figure of the Renaissance is that the inner contradictions of the era come to consciousness in his alert and capacious mind. Now, this is very important, as I will be repeating this particular point in various ways again and again throughout the class today. So, what I said was that what makes Hamlet the quintessential tragic figure of the Renaissance is that the inner contradictions of the era come to consciousness in his alert and capacious mind. So the inner contradictions, if we bring in our Freudian learning a bit, superimpose our Freudian learning over what I just said, the inner contradictions of the era, that is the repressed desires, come to consciousness in his alert and capacious mind. The repressed desires are manifested in the distorted deeds that Hamlet commits in the text or in his life. He is usually viewed as self-divided, but many critics treat his self-division as a kind of pathological state, as a disease. The contradictory nature of Hamlet's mind, of Hamlet's soul, of Hamlet's consciousness, many critics have viewed that as a disease, as a pathological state. Which is, of course, the critics who have viewed or studied Hamlet from the Freudian psychoanalytic perspective. Which also led to T.S. Eliot saying that Hamlet is an artistic failure, because he was also one person, a very influential one at that, if you think it from that point of view. T.S. Eliot said out loud in a very popular essay written by him, which is also one of is included in your syllabus, and probably I will be teaching you the same. T.S. Eliot's Hamlet and His Problems. He claims that Hamlet is an artistic failure precisely because Hamlet the character fails to objectify his desires, find the correct container to project his repressed desires. Now that is clearly a Freudian reading of the text. So these critics have seen, or so many others like him, who have read Hamlet only from the Freudian perspective and not from the other psychoanalytic approaches, who have viewed Hamlet as a pathologically diseased mind, very much like Macbeth. Just before murdering Duncan, he says that my mind is a heat-oppressed brain and it is making projections which are not real. If you remember the soliloquy, is this the dagger that I see before me? Oi soliloquy bolche, that are you a projection of the heat-oppressed mind? So that is nothing but a pathological state that he is referring to. But his self-division reflects a more fundamental division of his age. Indeed, Hamlet is distinguished in the play precisely by the fact that only he is truly aware of the contradictions in his era. It is only he who is aware. And the fact that Hamlet can be said to be the only person who is truly aware of the contradictions of his era, this fact is also located within the geography of Hamlet. Hamlet, the text, that is, the geography of the text, the setting, the physical setting of the text. The symbolic geography of Hamlet mirrors the interplay of forces that went to make up the Renaissance. Denmark becomes the state, or Denmark becomes the space, the literary space rather, in which we can see the forces interplaying with each other or encountering each other, those forces which make up Renaissance, which define Renaissance. Shakespeare's Denmark is a kind of borderland lying on the fringes of modern Europe, halfway between the old world of pagan heroism and the new world of Christian civility. To the north stands Norway, a yet untamed world of lawless resolutes, something which is mentioned within the text. It is associated with the struggle of elder Hamlet, the warrior, and the elder Fortinbras, who is also a youth warrior. Norway conjures up or helps us, it takes us back to the images of single combat, the era of duels between martial heroes. It is presented in the play as a kind of Homeric realm, the realm of classical era surviving on the frontiers of modern civilization. Out of this world comes younger Fortinbras, and with him whatever remains of the old style heroism in Hamlet. So it is from this place, which is also a space within the text of Hamlet, from where Fortinbras comes in. And from the younger 14 bras, we get a shadow of the dead elder Hamlet, because both are the same. Both are envied by our character Hamlet the hero. Both are looked upon by Hamlet as active figures who commit to their minds, who do rather than think. To the south of Denmark lies the heart of modern Europe. Cultivated cities like Paris, an unheroic world in which men learn to fence rather than to smite the sledded Polacks on the ice. Sledded Polacks on ice, the first act we come across this phrase, something that was in reference to elder Hamlet who had sledded Polacks on the ice. Paris, on the other hand, southern Denmark, on the other hand, is completely different from a land where Polacks are sledded on the ice by characters or by figures like elder Hamlet, like Fortinbras. So to the south of Denmark lies this place. Cities like Paris. As Laertes' attraction to the city shows, we come across his his description of Paris within the text. As his description shows, Paris is associated with new fashions of all kinds, from the latest styles of dress to the newest forms of entertainment and sport, including, for example, tennis and falconry. All of these are mentioned within the text. Claudius holds up a Norman named Lamord as a model of gentle manliness and chivalry for Laertes. This gallant is the sort of man who educates the wandering youths of Denmark. The Danes also head south for their education to Wittenberg, a university town associated in Shakespeare's plays with both Dr. Faustus and Martin Luther, and hence with the new intellectual and religious currents of both the Renaissance and the Reformation. Wittenberg is the place where both Martin Luther had got educated and the Dr. Faustus, both of these representative figures of the Renaissance and the Reformation. Martin Luther King brought about the Reformation in the 15th century. Thus, as often does in his tragedies, Shakespeare places his hero at the crossroads of a divided world. Shakespeare's Denmark is to the northern borders of Europe what his Cyprus is to the southern. So if you remember the tragedy of Othello, or if you have watched Omkara, it is actually a very good, one of the finest depictions of adaptations of the play. Bollywood eto hoyni, so I cannot compare it to any other Hindi film as such, but it is a favorite movie of mine. So if you remember Othello, or even if you have watched Omkara, Cyprus, the city, stands midway between the Christian civilization of Venice and the pagan barbarism of the Turkish Empire, and thus is the appropriate setting for the tragedy of Othello, who is a Moor, who is caught between these two worlds. Hamlet's geographical situation similarly reflects the range of ethical alternatives available to him. Placed, as it were, halfway between Norway and Paris, he is able to look beyond the borders of his country and, in effect, to survey the entire history of Western culture, to see its competing models of human excellence in the figures who surround him. There is Laertes, the model of a modern courtier, a young gallant trained in Paris. There is Hamlet's fellow student Horatio, schooled at Wittenberg in Stoic ideas, and a model of rational control. And finally, there is Fortinbras, Hamlet's Norwegian model of the heroic soldier. Hamlet can find something to admire in all of these models, but he can also see the limitations of each, partly because he measures one against the others. Precisely because he is open to all of them, He never becomes the captive of any one single model. And as a result, consequently, the other characters in the play seem to be quite one dimensional by comparison with Hamlet. Next to him, Laertes seems superficial and callow, Horatio cold and unfeeling, like the stoic that he proclaims to be, and Fortinbras rash and narrow minded. Comparing Hamlet to Laertes, Horatio, and Fortinbras reminds us that one's geographic situation is not in itself enough to generate tragedy. These characters are all placed roughly in the same locale as Hamlet, and yet they do not become tragic heroes. The reason is that they do not share his openness to the ethical alternatives this world offers. Hamlet is thus a peculiar form of heroism. Rather than pursuing one heroic model to an extreme, he moves back and forth between a number of competing heroic models, subjecting them all in the process of his critique. He criticizes all of them. What makes Hamlet stand out in his world is thus not a traditional greatness at all, not a traditional greatness of the soul, but the largeness of his horizons, the scope of his understanding, his heightened awareness of all that his complex culture contains, and the depth and authenticity of his response to its contradictory ethical demands. So, if it is a world in which contradictory alternatives exist, and if Hamlet claims to be putting a thought to all of these alternatives and then torturing himself upon being unable to come to a concrete conclusion that embodies all of the differences of the culture that he belongs to, it is quite right for him to become a procrastinator. It is quite right for him to become a thinker, a philosopher thinker. Because the dilemma that is presented to him by the ethical contradictions of the culture of the time that he belonged to, it is an appropriate response that Hamlet gives. Because if you are too swift to choose an option, you might just not have given the authentic attention, the appropriate attention that all of these contradictions of culture demanded. They do demand thoughtful perusal, they do demand a thoughtful understanding or approach towards all of these contradictory ethical elements that exist within Hamlet's culture. He is not capable of choosing any one model right away just because he wants to give each and every alternative a perfect amount of thought. And that is what is confounding him. That is what is confounding all of the people around him who have already chosen a side. And that is also what confounds us. Because it is easy for people to choose a side. What is difficult is to put some authentic thought to all of the points that are present in front of you, and then to come to what we call a quote-unquote informed decision. Coming to an informed decision is actually this difficult. If it has been easy for you, then your decision might just have left out a few alternative options that a few other people might have chosen, thus making you in a position of enmity, bringing you in a position of enmity, in a position of nemesis, in a position of acute contradictions to all of those people who have chosen an option that you have not chosen. But Hamlet is an enemy to none. Hamlet is only an avenger. He is an enemy to none. He does not harbor hatred for any one particular person, if you come to see it like that. His hatred is on the world itself, because he is the only one who is stable as the world around him is breaking down, rejecting old systems, inviting new ones, etc., etc. His soul itself becomes a kind of crossroads, a battleground on which pagan and Christian attitudes, ancient and modern values meet and fight to a standstill, leaving Hamlet unable to remain true to any one ethic and thus unable to accomplish what his concrete situation demands of him. Now, I have mentioned something again and again, something related to ethical dilemma, to ethics, the contradiction of alternative ethics that are present in front of him. So, it is important that we take a pause over here and learn something about ethics as we know it. How does the knowledge of ethics come to us? Because only if it has come to us, only then we can apply it to the text of Hamlet. So, it does not matter from which era these ethical studies have been derived, and it does not matter if it's later than the production of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet that is, because we are applying these theories to the text. So nonetheless, the time difference, it does not matter over here. And even if it does, you will find an appropriate justification for the same. So let's take a pause over here and learn something about ethics. So what is ethics? Charles Darwin, in The Descent of Man, that was produced in the early in the Victorian era, early 19th century, that is 1820s, I think, if I'm not wrong. So Darwin is writing The Descent of Man. He's saying, listen carefully, he's saying, there is no difference between action performed impulsively, which cannot be called moral, of course, if you're performing an action impulsively. There is no difference between those sorts of action, which cannot be called moral, and actions done deliberately, which are called moral. So Darwin, in this groundbreaking text that he produced, following which all sorts of biological theories, social theories will come to a standstill and alternate and change itself according to the Darwinian theory, evolutionary theory of man. Darwin is saying that there is no difference between an immoral act done impulsively and a moral act done deliberately. The social behavior which is lacking social behavior could be improved, he says, by changing our underlying biology. However, he thought it evil. He thought it very, very bad. He uses the word evil. However, he thought it evil for societies to select who should live and who should die. So he's saying he's putting forward quite a few contradictory ideas, completely opposite ideas. He's saying that lacking social behavior could be improved by improving our biology. Yet he's saying that it is evil for societies to choose who will live and who will die. He assumed that the existence of human beings was the evolutionary justification of the current moral sense. Therefore, social instincts already possessed by people should be reinforced. And he comes to the conclusion that moral theories are those theories of actual behavior which are felt to be right. So what human beings feel to be right, they become of paramount significance over here, what I feel to be right. Not the society which has the means to decide what is right and what is not. It is not a responsibility vested upon the society to decide. It is the individual who decides, because he assumes that individuals' existence already proves his right to exist already proves that he has evolved. Darwin যখন বলেছিলেন survival of the fittest, he did not mean the physical fitness that ensures survival. He was talking about the function of an individual. What purpose are you serving? And that makes you the fittest to survive. And whenever I talk about purpose and function, it inevitably links us to the society, because function is a relationary term. It is a term which is described in relation to other things, to other material, to other people, to other actions. So I as an individual can feel something to be right, but even that has a constraint, because it is my function that gives me the right to feel something. It is my function in the society, in the world, that gives me the right to exist. And as such, my decisions cannot be isolated from the society in which I live. It might sound confusing, but just rewind what I just said, and I'm quite sure you will be able to understand what I'm trying to say. Because যদি তোমরা ভাবো, if survival of the fittest was just out of physical attributes, a cockroach would have been at the top of the chain of being. It survives for the longest period of time. It is made like that. But what function does it serve? It serves zero function. And that is why it is not on the top of the chain of the being. Luckily, we are. Human beings are. Even though we are failing our existence completely at this point of time. The ethical problems in Hamlet, therefore, they are practical instances, they are practical examples of the tension that concretely exists, that visibly exists between our awareness of our own individual circumstance and our wider investment in the society that sustains us. Hamlet and other 17th century tragedies, Elizabethan tragedies, restoration tragedies, early restoration tragedies, Jacobean era tragedies, they emerged during a very important transitional time. They emerged during Reformation, when Aristotelian or scholastic philosophies, they were collapsing. Now, what is this scholastic and Aristotelian philosophy? Scholastic philosophy is something that is Aristotelian. So Aristotelian philosophy is of course derived from Platonic philosophy of idealism. There is an ideal world out there towards which we must strive to perfect ourselves. It does not look inward. Aristotelian philosophy does not look inward but outward. It is a philosophy of metaphysics, that there is a world that exists beyond our world, and that is the perfect world towards which we must constantly strive to achieve, to come closest to that ideal state of being. This is the Aristotelian philosophy. And this sort of thinking was collapsing at that point of time, at the time when Shakespeare was writing, when early 17th century or 17th century dramatists, playwrights were composing their plays. The Aristotelian philosophies of thinking, they were collapsing. And they were giving way to ethical inquiry towards solving problems, such as those of Luther, Martin Luther's doubts, the 99 theses that he pins during the Restoration towards on the door of the church, the corruption of the church that he's talking about. He's inquiring towards the ethics of the church. Descartes' theories, I think, therefore I am. It is an ethical inquiry of existence. What my consciousness is thinking, that is making me, yet my consciousness is not completely dissociated from the society in which we live. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, the theory of acute soul dictatorship, that there must be one fittest person who should be given the responsibility of ruling the entire world. So these were all problem-solving inquiries. why such a thing is happening and what can we do against it, as opposed to the Aristotelian philosophy of defining only the problems. And so, dramatic tragedy, being fictional, a public activity, they were completely unlike moral philosophy, which did not try to provide solutions. They were completely unlike moral philosophy, and they did not try to provide solutions, these dramatic tragedies. They communicated the problems effectively. Because moral philosophy, like those of Aristotle, Plato, like I mentioned, they were very much metaphysical philosophies. They looked towards different worlds that they thought, that they assumed to be ideal. They were looking for solutions that did not exist within our reach. And so these dramatic tragedies, they were more akin to ethical searchings of solutions rather than moral searching for solutions. And what they did best was that they communicated the problems most effectively, which today, after so many classes, we can say that Hamlet acutely does. It explores the problems of a time, of a space, of a man, of a society. Then comes John Locke. John Locke was completely against this approach that you look for solutions in an ideal world that may or may not exist. In the metaphysics, John Locke comes and says and propagates something called the tabula rasa. The tabula rasa, you must have heard of this phrase throughout several other classes as well. I would like to think so. The tabula rasa simply means mental blankness. The mind is a blank slate. Locke propagates the theory of tabula rasa and says that a problem should be solved by introspective study of one's own free thought, which Hamlet does. Hamlet does introspectively look towards his own mind, looks inward within himself. Ethics, Locke says, they are private speculation of an autonomous mind. The mind is free, yes, and it is blank. It is to be filled by individual introspection. Hamlet introspects why I am like this. If he would have been able to take a decision completely on his own, it would have been so easy for him, but he cannot. He knows that he exists in a society that sustains him. He knows that he needs to function in this society, otherwise he's just like an insect. And that is why his mind is completely filled with all of the ethical problems that exist all around him. He embodies those conflicts. He introspects, he thinks about those conflicts privately. Hamlet is thus a pragmatist. While Julius Caesar, another text by Shakespeare, allows the audiences by remaining observers in the suffering, Julius Caesar in the text, audiences, we just observe the suffering. Hamlet invites us to experience this suffering. Hamlet invites us to his mind. Come and see what is happening inside of my mind. Invites us to experience the problem of loss ourselves. Encourages us to test the efficacy of Brutus's practice firsthand. In Julius Caesar, it is a completely active play. Lots of actions happen in that particular play. It's a very good play, of course. Again, one of my favorites by Shakespeare. Julius Caesar is a very problem-solving play. Like there is a conflict that arises, people run towards solving it, that eventually becomes a larger conflict, and then other people run towards solving that, and we do have a solution. Brutus is dead, the rightful heir is the king, etc., etc. বাট এই যে অ্যাকশনের মাঝখানে যে কিছু ভাবনা চিন্তা হয়েছে, আমরা যদি এসি ব্র্যাডলির মতন একটুখানি ভাবি যে দিস ক্যারেক্টার্স আর রিয়েল ফিগার্স, হিউম্যান বিইংস অফ ফ্ল্যাশ অ্যান্ড ব্লাড, তাহলে এত অ্যাকশনের মধ্যে ব্রুটাস কিছু না কিছু তো চিন্তা ভাবনা করেছে ক্যাশিয়াসকে নিয়ে, সিজারকে নিয়ে। আমরা কিছু কিছু কনভারসেশনস we do have within the text, but not the fullest understanding of his mental confusion, right? যেটা ম্যাকবেথের মধ্যে আমরা একটু বেশি পাই, আর হ্যামলেটের মধ্যে সব থেকে বেশি পাই। So as I was saying, Hamlet says then, in the text, in the particular quotation that you can see in front of you, Hamlet says, Hamlet says, "Swans, show me what you would do, what thou would do." He talks to, in the grave digger scene, which we will be exploring a bit further in the next class. Very popular scene, of course. So Hamlet Gertrude asks Laertes, "Swans, show me what you would do. Would you weep? Would you fight? Would you fast? Would you tear thyself? Would you drink up easel, eat a crocodile? I will do it. Dost thou come here to whine, to outface me with leaping in her grave? Ophelia has died. Be buried quick with her, and so will I. And if thou prate of mountains, let them throw millions of acres on us, till our ground, singeing his pate against the burning zone, make Ossa like a wart. Nay, and thou'lt mouth, I'll rant as well as thou." So what is he saying? That he's asking the other people, what are you planning to do upon her death? I will do the same. I will do all of these things. He says this because he is concerned to argue that the magnitude of his grief can be discerned by what he does. The grief that he feels internally, the magnitude of the grief that he feels inside of him after the death of his father, after the betrayal of his uncle and mother, after the death of his beloved. He feels that the magnitude of his grief can be projected in the action that he commits. And therefore he says that whatever you will do, I will do the same. By weeping, fasting, fighting, ranting, by doing, quote unquote, by doing all these things, Hamlet demonstrates the greater sufferings. So এই doing, quote unquote, রাখার মধ্যে আমাদের একটা প্রশ্ন মাথায় আসা উচিত। That he's doing all of these things, he's thinking, he's weeping, he's grieving, he's fighting, fasting, ranting. Then why are we saying that Hamlet is a text of inaction? All of these are verbs, all of these are actions. Now this action inaction or conflict, we will carry it to the next class. So let's just keep that on hold for now. So Hamlet, by doing all of these things, he demonstrates the greater sufferings. He communicates his practical remedy to the great many of us who do not possess the steel of Roman soul. How many of us are that brave? And so, as opposed to Macbeth's blunt farewell, when he says, "Why, farewell, Portia, we must die," as opposed to Macbeth's blunt farewell, Hamlet suffers even before his death. Hamlet suffers while suffering. His sufferings exist on different planes, on different surfaces, in different levels. He cannot be like Horatio. He cannot be a rational thinker all the time. He cannot be a stoic like Macbeth is in this particular line, "Why, farewell, Portia, we must die." Yes, it's true. It's a practical truth. Yes. But there are some things that entail, that make us human beings before we die. And Hamlet embraces all of that. He embraces all of his weaknesses. He embraces all of the questions that arise in his mind, in his very, very fertile and green mind. And he acts upon those questions, he acts upon those confusions by being confused, by showing method in his madness, by introducing madness in method. And from the beginning, he is faced with an impossible task to exact a barbaric pagan vengeance with the tenderness of a civilized Christian. If Hamlet ultimately fails to achieve his revenge within the constraints laid down by his father's ghost, his failure results from his need to go beyond the limits of humanity. And thus, he is a tragic hero. It is because the how should I put it, the imperative, the mandate that has landed upon his head from the very beginning of the play by his father, by elder Hamlet. He is restricted by that because he has to commit that act. There is no second option to this. So it's already put a limit around his waist. And yet he is again limited on a larger level by the constraints of the society in which he lives, by the constraints of the individual that he is. And therefore, he is tragic, and therefore the text is a tragedy. So, do not think that we have come to a conclusion with understanding the tragedy of Hamlet. This is just, as I said, that this is one sort of a different approach that we just took. We introduced the ethical dilemma, we introduced ethics, spoke about a lot of new names. I spoke about Darwin, I spoke about Aristotle, we spoke about Descartes, we spoke about Hobbes, we spoke about John Locke. John Locke's tabular রাস্তাটা নিয়ে একটু পড়াশোনা করবে. Spoke about John Locke. Lots of people we spoke about over here. So we will be continuing with this train of thought in the next class, that is tomorrow. If you do have any problems, do come up, note that down, and you can come up with them tomorrow. So thank you very much. See you in the next class.